Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Today you will meet a woman who was betrayed in front of everyone and silenced for years. But on that night, something inside her finally awakened. And I invite you to stay until the end. Because this story is about being reborn where everyone expected her to sink. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing, the Alistair Sterling family mansion stood imposingly in the Belgravia district of London, with its 3 stories of light marble gardens designed by renowned landscapers and wrought iron gates that separated that world of appearances from the rest of the city. It was a Friday night, late April, and the main ballroom gleamed with crystal chandeliers that reflected golden light over the dozens of guests circulating among tables, decorated with arrangements of white roses and French champagne served in glasses that cost more than the monthly salary of many British families. Helen Alistair Sterling observed everything in that ballroom with a mix of familiarity and detachment. At 38, she knew every corner of that mansion, every painting hung on the walls, every antique piece of furniture that adorned the corridors. But on that night, wearing a cream silk dress she had chosen precisely because it was discreet, because it didn't draw attention, because it allowed her to pass almost unnoticed amidst the luxury and ostentation, Helen felt something was different. There was a tension in the air she couldn't identify, an invisible weight pressing on her chest and making her heart beat a little faster than normal. The party celebrated the 75th birthday of Sebastian Alistair Sterling, the family patriarch, a man who had built an empire in the real estate sector and who was equally respected and feared by all who knew him. Helen was married to Robert, Sebastian's eldest son, and for 12 years had played the role of perfect wife, impeccable hostess, and dedicated daughter-in-law. 12 years organizing dinners, entertaining important clients, smiling for society photographers, and keeping the house running like a well-oiled machine, always behind the scenes, always discreet, always in the shadows. Robert Alistair Sterling was the opposite of his wife. Tall, with perfectly coiffed black hair, a seductive smile, and a confidence bordering on arrogance, he moved through the ballroom like someone on a catwalk. At tea. 42, Robert was the vice president of the family company, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time until he took full command of the business. He was charismatic, knew exactly what to say to each person, how to tell jokes that elicited laughter, and how to flatter the right egos at the right time. And that night he was particularly radiant, gesturing animatedly as he chatted with a group of businessmen near the bar. Helen picked up a glass of sparkling water from one of the trays circulating through the ballroom. She didn't drink alcohol at events like that because she needed to keep her mind clear, to be attentive to the smallest details, to ensure everything ran perfectly. It was her invisible job, the role no one recognized, but everyone expected her to fulfill flawlessly. She looked around for the governess to confirm that dinner would be served on schedule when her eyes landed on a scene that made her stomach churn. Robert was next to a woman Helen recognized immediately, Julia Thorne. 32 years old, corporate lawyer, impeccably brushed red hair falling in waves over bare shoulders, a tight red dress that seemed painted on her, body sky-high heels, and a smile Helen could only describe as predatory. Julia had worked in the company's legal department for 3 years, and Helen had always felt there was something off about the way that woman looked at Robert, the way she found excuses to appear at family meetings, business dinners, social events. But seeing Julia there at that party, entering the Alistair Sterling family mansion as a guest, circulating through the ballroom with the ease of someone who felt at home, was something entirely different. And what made it even more painful was the way Robert behaved next, to her. He laughed too loudly, touched her arm with an intimacy that was impossible to ignore, leaned in to whisper something in her ear while she smiled with that air of complicity that made Helen feel as if she'd been punched in the stomach. Aunt Beatrice appeared beside Helen, a woman in her early 60s, grey hair pulled back in an elegant bun, a navy blue dress, and a gaze that missed nothing of what was happening around her. Beatrice was Sebastian's sister, and the only person in the family who had always treated Helen with genuine affection and respect. "Aunt Beatrice," Helen murmured without taking her eyes off Robert and Julia, "did you know she would be here tonight?" Beatrice followed her niece-in-law's gaze, and her face imperceptibly hardened. "I found out last night. Your father-in-law authorized Robert to invite some company employees. Apparently she was on the list." Helen felt her nails dig into the palms of her hands. For years, she had swallowed small humiliations, subtle comments, pitying glances from other wives who knew or suspected Robert's infidelity. But this was different. This was a public declaration. Such blatant disrespect that Helen could barely believe it was happening there in her house, in front of the entire family and closest friends. "Breathe, dear," Beatrice whispered, gently touching Helen's arm. "Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you lose control here." Helen nodded, but her hands trembled. She placed the glass on a nearby table because she was afraid of dropping it. She needed to get out of there. She needed air. She needed a moment to process that absurd situation. But before she could move away, Julia looked directly at her from across the room. It was a deliberate, calculated, almost defiant look. And then, to Helen's horror, Julia began to walk towards her, with Robert following close behind. "Well, look who's here," Julia said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, stopping right in front of Helen. "The hostess of the evening. Helen, isn't it? What a wonderful party. Congratulations on the organization." There was something in Julia's tone that made Helen's skin crawl. It wasn't exactly rude, but there was a layer of thinly veiled sarcasm, a suggestion of superiority that made it clear Julia didn't see her as an equal, but as someone she had already surpassed. "Thank you," Helen replied, keeping her voice steady, though she felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Robert approached, placing a hand on Julia's back in a gesture that was too intimate to be innocent. "Helen, I need you to sort out something in the kitchen. The chef was looking for you." It was a blatant lie. Helen knew because she had just spoken with the chef minutes earlier. Robert was trying to send her away, to get her out of the way so he could continue his parade with his mistress without the inconvenient presence of his wife. "The kitchen is under control," Helen said, looking directly at her husband. "There's nothing that needs my attention at the moment." Robert's smile flickered for a fraction of a second before he recomposed himself. "Well then, enjoy the party. Julia and I are going to greet some clients." They moved away and Helen felt her legs weaken. Beatrice held her arm firmly. "Let's get some air, dear, just for a minute." But before they could move, a man appeared beside them. Ralph Sterling was 35, a distant cousin of Robert's, son of an uncle who had moved to Scotland decades ago. Ralph rarely appeared at family events. He lived in Edinburgh where he worked as an architect, and Helen barely knew him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, had a quiet but firm presence, attentive brown eyes, and a serious expression on his face. "Aunt Beatrice," he greeted with a nod, then looked at Helen. "Excuse my intrusion, but are you two all right? It seems there was some kind of embarrassment." Beatrice exchanged a quick glance with Helen before replying, "We're fine, Ralph. Thank you for asking." Ralph didn't seem convinced, but didn't press the issue. He merely nodded and walked away, though Helen noticed he cast a long disapproving look in Robert and Julia's direction before turning. Dinner was served promptly at 9 o'clock. The tables were arranged in a U-shape in the main ballroom, with Sebastian seated at the head, flanked by his wife Aurora, an elegant 70-year-old woman who rarely spoke but observed everything with sharp eyes. Helen was supposed to be seated next to Robert, as always happened at these events, but when she arrived at her chair, she discovered that Julia had been positioned between her and her husband. It was a deliberate change in the seating arrangement that Helen had personally planned. Someone had tampered with the place cards. Helen looked at Robert, searching for some sign of embarrassment or apology, but he simply smiled and pulled out Julia's chair for her to sit, completely ignoring his wife. Helen sat in silence, feeling Beatrice's heavy gaze from across the table. Ralph was also observing the scene, and from the expression on his face, he had perfectly understood what was happening. Dinner unfolded in a haze of polite conversation and forced laughter. Helen barely touched her food, merely pushing it around her plate while listening to Julia dominate the conversation around her, making comments about international travel, Michelin-starred restaurants and expensive wines. It was as if she was marking her territory, making it clear to everyone that she wasn't just any guest, but someone who belonged to that world, that family, that life. When desserts were served, Sebastian stood up to make a brief speech thanking everyone for their presence. He spoke about family, tradition, and legacy, and Helen felt every word like a stab. What kind of family was this that allowed a situation like the one unfolding right under his nose? What kind of tradition was it that valued appearances more than respect and dignity? After the speech, guests began to stand up and circulate through the ballroom again. A live jazz band started playing, and some couples headed to the dance floor. Helen quickly stood up, desperately needing a moment alone, but Julia was faster. "Helen," she called out with that false tone of sympathy, "what an interesting dress you chose for tonight." Interesting. The word hung in the air, laden with venom. It wasn't a compliment. It was clearly a disguised criticism. "It's simple but elegant," Helen replied, maintaining her composure. "Simple is a good word," Julia agreed, looking Helen up and down with thinly veiled disdain. "Though I personally believe that on occasions like this, the wife of the company's vice president should shine a little more. After all, you represent the family, don't you?" Helen felt the blood rush to her face. That wasn't just a malicious comment, it was a deliberate public humiliation. Several nearby guests had stopped talking and were clearly paying attention to the exchange of barbs. "I represent myself," Helen said, with a firmness that surprised her. "And I choose to dress according to my own taste, not to satisfy others' expectations." Julia let out a cruel little laugh. Of course, to each their own style, isn't it? Some women prefer to go unnoticed." It was at that moment that Julia took a step forward, seemingly to approach Helen, but so abruptly that the glass of red wine she held in her hand tilted dangerously. Helen saw everything happen in slow motion, the dark red liquid spilling from the glass, flying through the air, and then spreading over the cream fabric of her dress like an open wound. The entire ballroom seemed to freeze. Conversations ceased. The music continued playing but seemed distant, muffled. Helen looked down, seeing the wine spreading over the fabric, staining, ruining, destroying. It wasn't just a dress. It was the last straw in years of silent humiliation. Julia brought a hand to her mouth in a theatrical gesture of shock. "Oh, how clumsy of me. I'm so terribly sorry, Helen. It was completely unintentional." But it hadn't been unintentional. Helen had seen the movement, had perceived the deliberate tilt of the wrist, the calculated angle. It had been purposeful, premeditated, cruel. Robert quickly approached, but it wasn't to comfort his wife. It was to protect Julia. "It was an accident," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Julia didn't mean any harm. These things happen." Helen looked at her husband incredulously. He was lying. In front of everyone, he was choosing to protect his mistress instead of defending his wife's dignity. It was the final confirmation of everything Helen had suspected, feared, and tried to deny for months. "It was not an accident," a firm male voice said from behind Helen. Everyone turned. Ralph Sterling stood there with an expression of indignation on his face. "I saw exactly what happened. That lady deliberately threw the wine on Helen's dress." Julia turned to Ralph, her eyes flashing. "How dare you accuse me of such a thing? I already apologized. It was an accident." "It wasn't," Ralph insisted, stepping forward, "and everyone here knows it. What I don't understand is how someone can have the audacity to do that in the home of the person they are humiliating." The ballroom erupted in murmurs. Guests began to move away or closer, dividing themselves between those who wanted to witness the confrontation and those who preferred to pretend nothing was happening. Beatrice appeared beside Helen, placing a shawl over her niece's shoulders and casting a furious glare at Robert. "This is absurd," Robert began, but Ralph interrupted him. "What's absurd is the lack of respect being shown here. This is Helen's home as much as it is yours, Robert, and if you can't see what's happening right under your nose, then perhaps it's time someone pointed it out." "You have nothing to do with this, Ralph," Robert said in a low, threatening voice. "I suggest you withdraw and let the family resolve its internal affairs." "Family?" Ralph gave a bitter laugh. "What part of this situation has to do with family?" A man who brings his mistress to humiliate his own wife in front of everyone understands nothing about the meaning of that word. Ralph's words echoed through the ballroom like thunder. Now there was no way to pretend, to hide, to maintain appearances. The truth had been spoken aloud, clear and unequivocal. Julia looked at Robert, expecting him to defend her, to deny the accusation, but Robert was pale, his eyes darting nervously between the guests who observed them with a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. Beatrice held Helen firmly by the arm. "Let's get out of here, dear. You don't need to go through this." Helen allowed her aunt to guide her out of the ballroom, with Ralph following close behind like a silent guardian. They walked down the long corridor leading to the library, away from the noise, away from the stairs, away from that nightmare. When the door closed behind them, Helen finally allowed the tears to fall. Beatrice hugged her while Ralph politely moved away to give them privacy, but remained near the door as if standing guard. For long minutes, Helen just cried, releasing years of pain, humiliation, and forced silence. When she finally managed to speak, her voice was hoarse. "He disrespected me in my own home, Aunt, in front of everyone." "I know, dear," Beatrice murmured, stroking Helen's hair. "I know, and I'm so sorry it came to this." "Why, Aunt?" Helen pulled away, looking at the older woman with despair. "Why did I put up with it for so long? Why did I let it get this far?" Beatrice held Helen's face in her hands. "Because you are strong. Because you believed in marriage, in family, in the promises that were made. But strength doesn't mean accepting being destroyed, Helen. There's a difference between being strong and being a doormat." Ralph hesitantly approached. "Excuse my intrusion, but she's right. What happened out there was unacceptable, and what's more, it wasn't just Julia's behavior that was awful. It was Robert's complicity, the way he chose to protect her instead of you." Helen wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "Everyone knew, didn't they? Everyone knew about the affair, and no one told me anything." "Not everyone knew," Beatrice corrected. "And those who suspected probably didn't have the courage to say anything. It's easier to pretend you don't see than to confront the truth." At that moment, the library door burst open, and Robert entered, with Julia right behind him. Their audacity in pursuing Helen even there, in not even granting her a few minutes of peace, made Ralph instinctively step forward, positioning himself between them and Helen. "We need to talk," Robert said, completely ignoring Ralph. "Helen, you're making an unnecessary scene. Julia already apologized. It was an accident." "It was not an accident," Helen repeated. But now her voice was different. It was no longer the trembling voice of a victim. It was the firm voice of someone who had reached their limit. "And even if it had been, the problem isn't just the wine on the dress, Robert. The problem is everything. It's you bringing your mistress into our home. It's you disrespecting me in front of the entire family. It's you blatantly lying to protect her instead of me." Julia stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with barely contained rage. "Well, well." The little saint finally found her voice. "What a novelty. You know, Helen, perhaps if you had paid more attention to your marriage, instead of being obsessed with being the perfect hostess, your husband wouldn't have needed to look for company elsewhere." It was Beatrice who responded, with a chilling voice Helen had never heard before. "Young woman, I strongly suggest you leave before you say something you'll regret. You have no idea what mess you're getting yourself into." Julia opened her mouth to reply, but at that moment a young waiter, no more than 20, appeared at the library door. He was pale, nervous, holding a cell phone in his trembling hands. "Excuse me for interrupting," he said, his voice failing, "but there's something you need to know. The scene out there in the ballroom was filmed from several angles, and some videos have already started circulating on social media." The silence that followed was absolute. Robert turned white. Julia brought a hand to her mouth. Helen, Beatrice, and Ralph exchanged quick glances. The waiter continued, his voice growing stronger as he realized the importance of the information he brought. "There's audio, too. The things that were said. Everything. And it's spreading fast. Very fast. People are already commenting, sharing, gossiping. The family name is being mentioned." Ralph took the cell phone from the waiter's hands with his permission and looked at the screen. He spent a few seconds scrolling, reading, watching, and then handed the device back. "It's true. And from the comments, public opinion is not on your side," he said, looking at Robert and Julia. Julia turned to Robert in a panic. "You need to do something. You need to take these videos down. This is going to ruin everything." "There's no way to take them down," the waiter said timidly. "They must have been downloaded and reposted hundreds of times already. That's how the internet works." Robert ran a hand over his face. The arrogant confidence that always characterized him had completely vanished. Shit, this can't be happening." Helen remained silent, processing that new turn of events. For years, she had been invisible, ignored, underestimated, and now, suddenly, her humiliation was public, but it was also his public downfall, both of theirs. The lie could no longer be sustained. Beatrice gently touched Helen's shoulder. "Dear, tell me your opinion of this story, and how you think it will end." Helen did not immediately answer Beatrice's question. She looked around the library, that space that had always been her refuge within the mansion, with its dark wooden bookshelves filled with books she had never had time to read, the leather armchairs where she imagined she could one day sit peacefully, and the tall windows overlooking the moonlit garden. For 12 years, she had hidden there whenever she needed a moment of peace, whenever the demands of being the perfect wife became too heavy. And now she was there again, but this time not as a temporary refuge. She was there because she had been expelled from her own drawing room, publicly humiliated, and worse still, her pain had been turned into entertainment for thousands of people who at that very moment were watching, commenting, and judging her life through small glowing screens. Robert began pacing back and forth in the library, running his hands through his hair in a nervous gesture Helen knew well. It was what he did when he was losing control of a situation. "We need to do damage control," he murmured more to himself than to the others. "I'll call the company's press office. They'll know what to do. They'll create a different narrative. They'll explain that it was all a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Ralph crossed his arms over his chest, his voice laden with incredulity. "What part was misunderstood exactly? The part where you brought your mistress to the family party, or the part where she deliberately threw wine on your wife?" "Shut up, Ralph," Robert hissed, turning to his cousin with eyes flashing with anger. "You don't understand anything about the situation. You barely show up at family events. You live up in Scotland pretending to be better than all of us, and now you decide to show up here to judge?" Ralph was not intimidated. "I rarely appear precisely because I can't stand all this hypocrisy, this false perfection, these appearances being maintained while everyone destroys each other from within. And you know what's worse, Robert? You think you're clever, that you control the narrative, but you've just proven you're nothing but a coward who can't even protect his own wife." Robert took a threatening step towards Ralph, but Beatrice stepped between the two men. "Enough, both of you. This is not the time for male ego battles. Helen has just been through the worst night of her life, and you're going to stand here measuring strengths?" Julia, who until then had remained silent, leaning against the wall, finally spoke, and her voice had a defensive and accusatory tone at the same time. "You're all acting as if I'm the villain of this story. I already apologized for the wine. It was an accident. And as for the rest, well, I'm not the one who should be judged here. If a marriage is bad, it's because there are problems on both sides. Helen is just as guilty as Robert for letting things get to this point." Julia's words hung in the air like poison. Helen felt something stir within her, something that had been dormant for years, buried under layers of submission and silence. She slowly rose from the armchair where she was sitting, and everyone in the room turned to look at her. There was something different in her posture, in the way she lifted her chin, in the hard glint that had appeared in her eyes. "You're right about one thing, Julia," Helen said with a chilling calm. "A bad marriage has problems on both sides. I made many mistakes. I was too submissive. I accepted too much. I swallowed too much. I pretended too much. But do you know the difference between my mistakes and yours? I always tried to fix what was broken. You decided to destroy it completely." Julia laughed disdainfully. "How dramatic you are, Helen. That's not how the world works. People fall in love. Marriages end. That's life." "That's life," Helen repeated, taking a step towards Julia. "Then I'll tell you what real life is like. You can have Robert. You can have all his attention, his cheap compliments, his expensive dinners, and his inflated ego. But you will never have what I built here. You will never have 12 years of dedication, sacrifice, loyalty. You will never have the peace of mind of knowing you built something solid, because everything you have with him is based on lies, betrayal, and disrespect. And one day, Julia, you will be on the other side of this story, because men who cheat once, cheat always. Julia's face turned red. How dare you tell me what will happen in my future? You don't know me, you know nothing about us. I know more than you imagine, Helen replied, keeping her voice firm. I know you think you're clever, you think you're better than me, you think you're more interesting, more beautiful, more everything. But deep down, Julia, you're just a desperate woman trying to steal someone else's life because you can't build your own. Julia advanced towards Helen, but Ralph was faster, positioning himself between the two. I think you'd better leave, he said, staring fixedly at Julia, before this gets any worse. Julia turned to Robert, expecting him to defend her, to take her side, but Robert was completely lost, still trying to process the disaster the night had become. Robert, she called out in a high-pitched voice, are you going to let them treat me like this? Robert opened and closed his mouth a few times before he could speak. Julia, perhaps it really is better if you go. I'll call you tomorrow. We need to let things cool down. That was the last straw for Julia. Her eyes widened in shock and anger. Are you kidding me? After everything we've been through together, you're going to send me away to protect your reputation and your hypocritical family. Please, Julia, Robert said with a pathetic plea in his voice. Don't make this harder than it already is. Harder? Julia laughed bitterly. You promised me you would leave your wife. You promised me we would be together publicly. And now at the first sign of trouble, you throw me to the wolves. Beatrice shook her head in disapproval. How many women before you heard the same promises, girl? Did you really think you were special? The truth of Beatrice's words hit Julia like a slap. She looked around the room at the faces that judged her and seemed to finally understand that she had lost. Without another word, she left the library, slamming the door shut, the sound echoing through the mansion's corridors. Robert let out a long, tired sigh, but before he could say anything, the door opened again. This time it was Sebastian Alistair Sterling who entered, followed by his wife Aurora. The patriarch was 75, but still an imposing man, broad-shouldered and upright. His white hair was perfectly combed back, his tuxedo impeccable, but there was a storm in his eyes that made everyone in the room instinctively recoil. Sebastian walked slowly to the center of the library, his heavy footsteps muffled by the Persian rug. He looked at each person present, his gaze lingering particularly on Robert, who suddenly seemed to have reverted to a scared boy before his father's authoritative figure. Someone, Sebastian said, in a voice that didn't need to be loud to be terrifying, could explain to me why the birthday party that was supposed to celebrate my family and my 75th year turned into a live-streamed circus of horrors for half of London. No one responded. The silence was so thick that Helen could hear her own heart beating. Aurora approached her and gently touched her shoulder in a gesture of silent comfort. Her mother-in-law had never been particularly warm, but at that moment there was a tacit solidarity between the two women. "Robert," Sebastian called, without taking his eyes off, his son. "Come here." Robert approached his father with hesitant steps. "Father, I can explain. Things got out of control, but I'll fix it. I already have a plan for damage control. The press office will create a narrative. We'll say it was all a misunderstanding between guests. We'll minimize the impact on the company and the family." Sebastian raised his hand, signaling for silence, and Robert stopped speaking immediately. "Do you really think I care about the press narrative right now? Do you think my concern is about what the newspapers will say tomorrow?" Robert blinked, confused. "Isn't it?" "No," Sebastian replied, his voice laden with disappointment. "My concern is the fact that I raised a son who has not the slightest respect for his own wife. A son who had the audacity to bring his mistress into the house where he lives, in front of the entire family, and then still blatantly lied trying to protect her while allowing Helen to be publicly humiliated." "But father," Robert tried to argue, "things between Helen and me have been complicated for years. The marriage has been over for a long time. I was just trying to move on." Sebastian took such an abrupt step towards his son that Robert instinctively recoiled. "Move on? You call destroying another person's dignity to satisfy your own whims moving on? Robert, I taught you about business, about strategy, about leadership. But apparently I failed to teach you about character, about honor, about basic human decency. The patriarch's words echoed through the library, and Helen saw something she had never witnessed before. Robert beginning to cry. These were not tears of genuine remorse, but of a man who was finally being confronted with the consequences of his actions and realizing there was no easy way out. Beatrice approached Sebastian, gently touching her brother's arm. Sebastian, perhaps we should continue this conversation in private. There are things that need to be discussed and decided, but Helen has suffered enough for one night. Sebastian nodded, agreeing with his sister. You're right. Helen, my dear, I am very sorry for what happened here today. You deserved none of this, and I want you to know that I will take steps to ensure you are treated with the respect you have always deserved, but never received. Helen didn't know what to say. For 12 years, Sebastian had been a distant figure, someone she respected but who had never truly seen her. And now, for the first time, she felt she was being seen, recognized, validated. "Thank you, Mr. Sebastian," she managed to murmur. "Don't thank me yet," he said with a small, sad smile. "Because what I'm about to do will change a lot of things, for all of us." He turned to Robert again. "You are suspended from your duties at the company until further notice. I don't want you near the office. I don't want you making decisions. I don't want you representing the Alistair Sterling family in any professional capacity until this scandal is fully resolved and you demonstrate that you have learned something from this mess you created." Robert turned white. "Father, you can't do this. I'm the vice president. I have contracts to close, negotiations underway, projects under my responsibility." "You had," Sebastian corrected. "Now you have a temporary suspension and plenty of time to reflect on your choices. And one more thing. You are leaving this house tonight. Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight." Robert shook his head in disbelief. "But this is my home. I live here. Where do you expect me to go?" Sebastian shrugged. "That's your problem. There are hotels in London. There are apartments for rent. You'll find out, but you will not spend another night under this roof after what you've done." Aurora, who until then had remained silent, finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Your father is right, Robert. You need to leave. You need to learn that actions have consequences." "But mother," Robert pleaded, turning to Aurora in despair. "No, son," she interrupted. "Don't try to manipulate me. I sat there throughout dinner watching what was happening. I saw how you treated Helen. I saw how that woman behaved. And I was ashamed. Ashamed of you, of the man you have become." His mother's words were the final blow. Robert staggered as if he had been physically hit. Helen observed everything with a mixture of relief, shock, and a strange sense of freedom. For so many years she had been the only one to bear the pain, to swallow the humiliation, to maintain silence. And now, finally, other people were seeing, recognizing, taking a stand. Sebastian turned to Aurora. "Darling, could you accompany Helen to her room? She needs to rest. Tomorrow we will have much to discuss and decide, but today has been too heavy already." Aurora nodded and extended her hand to Helen. "Come, my dear, let's leave the men to sort out the rest." Helen looked at Beatrice, who gave her an encouraging smile, and then at Ralph, who nodded in approval. She took Aurora's hand and the two women left the library together, leaving behind the men and the storm that was still far from over. As they ascended the mansion's main staircase, Aurora spoke softly. "Helen, there's something you need to know, something very few people know, but it will make a difference in the coming days." Helen looked at her mother-in-law with curiosity and a touch of apprehension. "What is it?" Aurora stopped midway up the stairs and turned to face her. "This house, this mansion where you've lived for 12 years, is not in Robert's name. It never was." Helen frowned, confused. "What do you mean? I thought it was family property, that it would pass to him when Mr. Sebastian retired." "It is family property," Aurora confirmed. "But it was registered in your name when you got married. It was a wedding gift from Sebastian. He wanted to ensure you had security, protection, At the time I questioned the decision. I thought it was hasty, but now I see that my husband was wiser than I imagined." Aurora's words took a few seconds to process. When they finally sank into Helen's understanding, she had to lean on the banister to keep from losing her balance. "This house is mine." "It's yours," Aurora confirmed. "Legally and officially. And that means tomorrow, when all this dust settles a bit, you'll have important decisions to make. Decisions about your future, about the future of your marriage, about who enters and who leaves this property." Helen felt tears welling up again, but this time they weren't just from pain. They were from something more complex, a mixture of sadness for the end of an era and hope for the beginning of another. "I didn't know. All these years I had no idea." "Sebastian wanted it that way," Aurora explained. "He said that if you knew, you might feel pressured. You might think you owed something in return. He wanted you to feel at home simply because it was your home, not because there were papers saying so." They continued up the stairs, in silence until they reached the bedroom Helen had shared with Robert for 12 years. Aurora opened the door, and the two entered. The room was large, elegant, tastefully decorated in shades of beige and white. The king-size four-poster bed, the silk curtains, the spacious closet where his and her clothes mingled. Everything there told the story of a marriage that existed in appearances but had long since died in its essence. "I'll send Rosalind to help you take off that dress and bring you something to eat," Aurora said. "And if you need anything at all, just call me. I'll be in the room next to Sebastian's." "Thank you, Mrs. Aurora," Helen said sincerely, "for everything, for being by my side when I needed it most." Aurora gently touched Helen's face with maternal tenderness. "You have always been a good daughter-in-law, Helen. Dedicated, respectful, hard-working. I only regret not having realized sooner how much you were suffering in silence. But now that I see, that I understand, I promise I will do everything in my power to ensure you have the life you deserve." After Aurora left, Helen was finally alone. She walked to the full-length mirror in the corner of the room and looked at herself. The cream silk dress was ruined by the red wine stain that spread like a red wound across the light fabric. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged by tears. But it was in her eyes that the most significant change had occurred. They no longer held that resigned glint of submission. There was something new there. Determination, perhaps, or simply the realization that there was no turning back. Rosalind, the governess who had worked at the mansion for over 20 years, arrived a few minutes later, bringing a tray with hot tea and biscuits. She helped Helen take off the stained dress, brought a soft bathrobe and offered to stay for company, but Helen thanked her and said she preferred to be alone. When she finally lay down in bed, Helen picked up the cell phone she had left on the bedside table and, against her better judgment, opened social media. It only took a few seconds to find the videos. They were everywhere. Some showed the exact moment Julia threw the wine. Others captured the discussion that followed. There were even isolated audios with the most impactful statements. The comments were in the thousands. Some defended Helen, others blamed her for not having noticed the betrayal sooner, others still made cruel jokes about the situation. Helen read for almost an hour, absorbing every opinion, every judgment, every malicious comment and every message of support. And at some point during that reading, something definitively changed within her. She realized that it didn't matter what strangers on the internet thought of her life. It didn't matter if they blamed her or defended her. What mattered was what she, Helen, was going to do from that moment on. How she was going to rebuild her life. How she was going to reclaim her dignity. How she was going to use that pain, that humiliation, that horrible experience as fuel to become who she always should have been. She turned off her phone, placed it back on the bedside table and closed her eyes. Outside, the party had ended. The guests had left, taking their gossip and judgments with them. The mansion was silent, except for the distant sounds of footsteps and muffled voices as the family dealt with the consequences of the disastrous night. But there, in that room, in that bed, Helen finally found peace. Not the peace of submission or resignation, but the peace that comes from decision. The decision that she would never again be invisible, never again be silenced, never again allow her dignity to be treated as something negotiable. And when sleep finally came, it brought not nightmares but dreams of a different future. A future where she was the protagonist of her own story, not just a supporting character in someone else's. Helen woke up to the first rays of sun entering through the silk curtains of the bedroom. For a brief moment, still drowsy, she almost forgot the events of the previous night. But then her gaze fell upon the stained dress thrown over a chair in the corner of the room, and everything came rushing back. The party, Julia, the wine, the public humiliation, the videos going viral on social media, the confrontation in the library, Sebastian and Aurora's revelations. She slowly sat up in bed, feeling her body heavy as if she had been run over. She looked at the empty side where Robert used to sleep and realized that for the first time in 12 years, she had spent the entire night alone in that room. He really had left the house. He had been expelled by his own father. The reality of it still felt surreal. She got up and walked to the bathroom, where she took a long, hot shower, letting the water wash away not only the physical dirt, but also some of the emotional weight of the previous night. When she stepped out of the shower and looked at herself in the mirror again, she saw a different woman. Her eyes were still red and swollen from crying so much, but there was something new there, a determination she didn't recognize in herself. She put on comfortable jeans and a simple white blouse, tied her wet hair in a loose bun, and went down for breakfast. Upon reaching the kitchen, she found Beatrice already sitting at the table, drinking coffee and reading something on her tablet. Her aunt looked up when Helen entered and smiled warmly. "Good morning, dear. Did you manage to get some sleep?" Helen nodded as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "I slept better than I expected, actually. I think my body just shut down from exhaustion." Beatrice turned off her tablet and pushed it away as if she didn't want Helen to see what she was reading. But Helen already knew. They were articles about the scandal, news on gossip sites, endless comments on social media, her name, her private life, her pain, all transformed into public entertainment. "You don't need to hide it, Aunt," Helen said, taking the tablet. "I already saw everything last night. I read every comment, watched every video. I know exactly what people are saying out there." Beatrice sighed deeply. "Helen, you shouldn't torment yourself reading those things. Most people commenting don't know anything. They just want to be part of the drama." "I know," Helen agreed, taking a sip of coffee, "but I need to know what's being said. I need to understand the scale of the problem. Because now it's not just about me and Robert. It's about the entire family, about the company, about the reputation that has been built over decades." At that moment, Sebastian entered the kitchen, followed by Aurora. The patriarch seemed to have aged 10 years overnight. There were deep, dark circles under his eyes, and his posture, always so upright and imposing, was slightly curved, as if the weight of the situation was literally pressing down on his shoulders. "Helen," he said, sitting at the table, "we need to talk. There are decisions that need to be made, and you are at the center of all of them." Helen placed her coffee cup on the table and looked directly at her father-in-law. "I'm listening." Sebastian interlaced his fingers on the table, adopting the executive posture he used when he needed to make difficult decisions. "First, I want you to know that overnight Aurora and I had a long talk with Robert. He's staying at a hotel in Kensington, and is, to say the least, in a state of shock. He wants to come home, he wants to talk to you, he wants to try and fix things." "And what did you tell him?" Helen asked, keeping her voice firm. "I told him the decision isn't mine. It's yours. This is your home, Helen. It always has been, even if you didn't know it. And you have every right to decide who enters and who doesn't." Helen felt a tightening in her chest. For 12 years she had been conditioned to accept, to yield, to accommodate. And now, suddenly, she had decision-making power over something so fundamental. "I'm not sure I'm ready to make that decision now. I'm still processing everything that happened." "And you don't have to decide now," Aurora interjected, placing her hand over Helen's. "Take all the time you need, but while you decide, Robert stays where he is. He doesn't return to this house until you, and only you, authorize it." Beatrice stood up and served more coffee for everyone before sitting back down. "But there are other matters besides the personal, aren't there, Sebastian? The company, the clients, the partners. Everyone must be wanting." Answers. Sebastian nodded heavily. The family lawyer, Dr. Marianne Foster, called early this morning. She's coming here at 10 o'clock for an emergency meeting. We'll need to discuss the impact of this situation on the company, possible lawsuits, Robert's position, everything. And Helen, you need to be present at this meeting. Me? Helen blinked in surprise. Why? I have nothing to do with the company. You have more than you imagine, Sebastian said, with a small, sad smile. You are the vice president's wife, and more importantly, you are a victim in this whole story. Everything we decide will affect you, directly. You have the right to be present, to listen, to give your opinion and to protect your interests. Before Helen could answer, Ralph entered the kitchen. He was wearing jeans and a simple shirt, his hair still wet from his morning shower, and he carried his laptop under his arm. Good morning, everyone. Excuse my intrusion, but I thought you should know that the news has spread even further overnight. There are articles on practically all the news and entertainment websites in London. Some TV stations are considering mentioning the case on their morning shows. Sebastian closed his eyes, briefly as if making a superhuman effort to maintain composure. This is a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. Ralph pulled up a chair and sat at the table, opening his laptop. Look, I don't want to be insensitive, but we need to think strategically about this. The narrative being told now is that of the betrayed wife, publicly humiliated by her husband's mistress. It's a story that generates sympathy for Helen and antipathy for Robert and Julia. This, as bad as the situation is, can be worked to our advantage. Worked to our advantage? How? Beatrice asked skeptically. Ralph turned the laptop so everyone could see the screen. Look at the comments. The vast majority are in support of Helen. Women identifying with her, men outraged by Robert's behavior, people demanding justice. This creates enormous social pressure. If the company tries to protect Robert now, it will look like it's condoning his behavior. But if they take firm measures, demonstrate that they don't tolerate this kind of conduct, they can transform an image crisis into a demonstration of ethical values. Helen looked at the screen, reading some of the comments. There were thousands of them. Some were cruel and invasive, but most genuinely showed support and solidarity. It was strange and unsettling to see her personal life being discussed by complete strangers. But Ralph was right. The narrative was on her side. This seems very calculated, Helen said uncomfortably, as if we're using my pain as a marketing tool. It's not about marketing, Ralph gently corrected. It's about justice. You were publicly humiliated. Now you have the chance to reclaim your dignity, also publicly. And as a bonus, ensure that Robert faces the real consequences of his actions, not just a slap on the wrist and an empty promise that he'll change. Sebastian watched his nephew with interest. Continue. Ralph turned his attention back to the laptop, clicking on a few tabs. The Alistair Sterling Company is known for its family values, right? You sell not just properties, but the promise of homes, stability, future. How does that narrative hold up when the company's vice president is caught cheating on his wife and allowing her to be humiliated? It creates enormous cognitive dissonance. Clients will wonder if they can trust a company whose leader cannot even honor the most basic commitments. Aurora leaned forward with interest. And what would your suggestion be? Ralph? Ralph closed the laptop and looked around the table. Transparency and accountability. An official company statement acknowledging the incident that occurred during the family party, expressing support for Helen, and confirming that Robert is temporarily suspended from his duties while an internal investigation is conducted, not trying to hide or minimize, facing it head-on and turning it into a declaration of principles. Beatrice nodded slowly. That makes sense. It's risky, but it makes sense. There's a catch, though, Sebastian said, tapping his fingers on the table. If we do this, we'll essentially be throwing Robert to the wolves publicly. He's my son. However bad what he did was, he's still my son. The silence that followed was heavy. Helen looked at Sebastian and saw the real anguish in his eyes. He was a father who loved his son, but also a man of principles who understood the difference between right and wrong. And at that moment, he was divided between these two identities. Mr. Sebastian, Helen said softly, I understand your pain. I know he is your son, and that protecting him is your natural instinct. But what about the children we didn't have, the children I always wanted to have but who never came because Robert always said it wasn't the right time, that we needed to wait a little longer? Could one of the reasons be that he was already involved with someone else, with other people? How many Julias existed before her? The question hung in the air like a silent accusation. Aurora brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes watering. She had clearly never thought of it from that perspective. Helen continued, her voice gaining strength. For 12 years I was the perfect wife. I organized your home, entertained your clients, supported his career, put my own dreams aside so he could shine. And what did I get in return? Betrayal, lies, disrespect. And now you ask me to consider his feelings, to spare his reputation. I'm not asking that, Sebastian said quickly. I'm just verbalizing my internal conflict. But you are right, absolutely right. Robert made his bed, now he has to lie in it. At that moment, Rosalind appeared at the kitchen door looking nervous. Excuse me for interrupting, but there's someone at the gate asking to come in. She says her name is Julia Thorne and she urgently needs to speak. With Mrs. Helen. All eyes turned to Helen. She felt her heart race but kept her voice calm as she replied, Tell her to leave. I have nothing to say to that woman. She insists it's important, Rosalind continued. She says she has information you'd want to know about Robert. Beatrice scoffed indignantly. The audacity of that girl. First she humiliates you publicly, and now she wants to come into your home to spread gossip about your husband. But Ralph raised his hand, asking for attention. Wait, it might be interesting to hear what she has to say. Not necessarily to believe or act based on it, but at least to know what cards are on the table. Rejected women sometimes release information that can be useful. Helen considered for a long moment. Part of her wanted to send Julia away and never have to see that face again. But another part, the new part that was emerging, the part that no longer wanted to be ignorant or naive, wanted to know. She wanted to understand the full extent of the betrayal. She wanted all the information before making any decisions about her future. You can let her in, Helen, finally said, but not alone with her. I want you all to be present, all of you. Sebastian nodded, approving the decision. We'll receive her in the living room. Rosalind, let her in, but make her wait for 5 minutes. No need to make things easy for her. 5 minutes later, everyone was positioned in the living room. Sebastian and Aurora sat on the main sofa, Beatrice in an armchair beside them, Ralph standing near the window in a protective stance, and Helen sat alone in a chair in the center of the room, like a queen on her throne, awaiting a plea. When Julia entered, it was clear that the night had not been kind to her either. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, no makeup, her red hair tied in a disheveled ponytail. Her eyes were red and swollen. She looked like a completely different version of the confident and provocative woman from the night before. Julia stopped at the entrance to the room, clearly intimidated by the number of people present and the icy stares she received. Her eyes met Helen's, and she opened her mouth to speak but couldn't emit a sound on the first try. She cleared her throat and tried again. Helen, I know you don't want to see me. I know you probably hate me, and you have every right, but I need to talk to you. I need to tell you some things you should know. Helen maintained a neutral expression. I'm listening. Julia took a few more steps into the room, wringing her hands nervously. Robert called me this morning. He was desperate. He said the family abandoned him, that he was kicked out of the house, that he's being removed from the company. And then he said something that made me realize I was a complete idiot. Continue, Helen said without showing any emotion. He said all of this is my fault, that I ruined everything by showing up at the party and drawing attention, that if I had just stayed quietly in my corner, none of this would have happened. And then he said, and these were his exact words, that I never meant anything to him beyond a convenient distraction. Aurora let out a sound of disapproval, but said nothing. Julia continued, tears starting to stream down her face. I thought we were special. I thought he really loved me. He said he was going to leave you, that we were going to be together, that he was going to give me the life I always wanted. And I believed it. I was foolish, and I believed it. But this morning, when he called me, I realized I was just another one. Another in a long line of women he used and discarded. "And you came here to tell me this because?" Helen asked, keeping her voice cold. "Do you want me to pity you? Do you want me to forgive you for deliberately trying to humiliate me yesterday?" "No," Julia replied, shaking her head vigorously. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I came because you need to know who the man you're married to is. You need to know that I'm not the first and certainly won't be the last. Robert has a new assistant in the office, Marissa. She's 23, and I saw the way he looks at her, the same way he looked at me in the beginning." Sebastian abruptly rose from his chair, his face red with anger. "Is this true? My son is harassing female employees at the company?" Julia turned to him. "I wouldn't say harassing exactly. He's subtle, charming. He makes you feel special, unique. But yes, he's clearly interested in her. And if history repeats itself, in a few months she'll be in the same position I was in yesterday. The other woman, the mistress, the disposable one." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing that information. Part of her wasn't surprised. In fact, it made a lot of sense. Robert's behavioral patterns, the flimsy excuses, the constant delays. It wasn't just Julia. It probably had never been just one. "There's more," Julia said, her voice now firmer, as if having started to speak had given her courage to continue. "Robert embezzled money from the company. Not a huge amount, but enough to be considered misappropriation. He used corporate funds to pay for trips with me, expensive dinners, gifts, all registered as business expenses, but it was personal. I have proof, receipts, messages where he admits it. I was going to keep it as insurance in case he decided to discard me, and that's exactly what he did." The silence that followed was absolute. Sebastian looked as if he was about to have a heart attack. Aurora was pale. Beatrice shook her head in disbelief. Ralph pulled out his phone and began taking mental notes, and Helen simply sat there, processing the full dimension of the betrayal, the dishonesty, the lack of character of the man with whom she had shared 12 years of her life. "Do you have these proofs?" Sebastian asked in a trembling voice. Julia nodded. "I have everything, and I'm willing to hand it over to you, not out of kindness, but because I'm furious. Furious with him, furious with myself for being so blind, furious for having wasted time and reputation on someone who never truly valued me." Helen finally rose from her chair and walked until she stood face to face with Julia. The two women looked at each other for a long moment, each seeing in the other's gaze a different reflection of the same story of manipulation and deceit. "Thank you for coming here," Helen said, surprising everyone in the room. "Thank you for having the courage to tell me the truth, even knowing that I had every reason to kick you out without hearing a word. This doesn't erase what you did yesterday. It doesn't erase the pain you caused, but at least it gives me information I can use to make the right decisions moving forward." Julia nodded, wiping away her tears. "I really am sorry, Helen. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for everything." Helen didn't reply. She simply turned and returned to her chair. Ralph accompanied Julia to the door, taking from her an envelope with the proofs she had mentioned. When the door closed and they were alone again, Sebastian exploded. "That boy has completely lost his mind. Corporate embezzlement, that's a crime. That could destroy the company. Destroy everything I've built over decades." "Calm down, Sebastian," Beatrice said, placing a hand on her brother's arm. "Let's take it easy. First, we need to see these proofs, assess the extent of the problem, and then decide the next steps. It won't do any good to make hasty decisions now." Ralph returned to the room holding the envelope. "I'll need to pass this on to Dr. Marianne when she arrives. She'll know exactly how to proceed." Helen remained seated in silence, looking out the window at the sunny garden outside. Everything seemed so normal, so peaceful out there. The trees, swaying gently in the wind, the birds singing, the gardener watering the plants. As if the world hadn't just collapsed around her, as if her life hadn't been completely turned upside down in less than 24 hours. But perhaps, she thought, this wasn't the end. Perhaps it was just the beginning of something different, of something new, of something where she could finally be more than just the perfect wife, the impeccable hostess, the invisible woman who kept everything running behind the scenes while others took the credit. When the lawyer arrived in a few hours, when they had to discuss next steps, legal actions, division of assets, all of it. Helen knew she would be ready, because for the first time in 12 years, she was finally beginning to find her voice, and that voice would no longer be silenced. Dr. Marianne Foster arrived promptly at 10 o'clock in the morning, bringing with her a leather briefcase full of documents and an air of professional seriousness that immediately changed the atmosphere of the room. She was a woman in her early 50s, with grey hair cut into an elegant bob, discreet framed glasses, and an impeccable navy blue suit. For over 20 years, she had handled the legal affairs of the Alistair Sterling family and had seen everything, but even she seemed slightly shaken by the current situation. "Good morning, everyone," she greeted, placing the briefcase on the dining room table where everyone had gathered. "I don't think I need to say that the situation is serious, very serious. But before we start discussing solutions, I need to understand exactly what we have on our hands." Sebastian gave a concise summary of the previous night's events, including the wine incident, the videos going viral, the confrontation in the library, and Robert's expulsion from the mansion. Then Ralph handed over the envelope Julia had brought, explaining the accusations of corporate embezzlement. Marianne opened the envelope and spent the next few minutes examining the documents in absolute silence. Her face remained neutral, but Helen noticed that her jaw was tense and that she sighed heavily with each new page she read. Finally, she took off her glasses and massaged the bridge of her nose before speaking. "This is extremely problematic," she said, choosing her words carefully. "We have here receipts from expensive restaurants, hotel bills, airline tickets, all registered as corporate expenses, but clearly personal in nature. If this leaks to the press, and considering there's already an ongoing scandal it's very likely to leak, the company could face serious problems. Tax investigations, loss of credibility, lawsuits from minority shareholders, and Robert could face criminal charges for misappropriation of funds." Aurora brought a hand to her chest, breathing with difficulty. Beatrice immediately stood up to help her, bringing a glass of water. "Calm down, sister-in-law. Breathe slowly." Sebastian was pale. "Is it possible to contain this, to resolve it internally, to make Robert return the amounts and prevent it from becoming public?" Marianne put her glasses back on and looked directly at Sebastian. "Mr. Sebastian, with all due respect, you need to understand that we are no longer in private territory. From the moment those videos began circulating, you entered the public domain. There are eyes on you now. Journalists investigating, curious people looking for information, even regulatory bodies that might decide to conduct a spontaneous audit just because of the negative exposure. Trying to hide or resolve this behind the scenes at this moment could look like a cover-up and make things even worse." "So, what do you suggest?" Sebastian asked, his voice tired. Marianne opened her briefcase and took out some documents. "I suggest we be proactive. First, the company should issue an official statement acknowledging the incident that occurred during the family party, expressing support for Helen, and confirming that Robert is temporarily suspended from his duties while an internal investigation is conducted. Second, you should hire an external and independent audit to review all corporate expenses for the past 5 years, especially those authorized by Robert. Third, Helen needs to decide whether she wants to continue the marriage or initiate separation proceedings, and depending on that decision, we'll need to discuss the division of assets and her rights to family properties." Helen felt all eyes turn to her. It was the question that had hung in the air since the previous night, but that no one had dared to ask directly. "What will you do, Helen? Will you forgive? Will you try to save the marriage, or will you move on alone?" Before she could answer, her cell phone began to ring. Robert's name appeared on the screen. Everyone in the room saw it, but no one said anything. Helen looked at the phone for a long moment, before answering, putting it on speaker so everyone could hear. "Hello," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Helen, thank you for answering." Robert's voice on the other end sounded desperate. "I need to talk to you, personally. Please, just give me a chance to explain, to apologize properly." "Robert, there's nothing to explain," Helen replied. "I saw everything. Everyone saw everything. And now I also know about the embezzlement from the company, about the other women, about everything." There was silence on the other end of the line, "Julia," he finally said with anger in his voice, "that vixen went there and told lies about me." "They weren't lies," Helen corrected. "She brought proofs, receipts, messages, all documented, so don't try to deny or distort the facts." "Helen, please," Robert's voice broke. "I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but we can fix this. We can go to couples therapy. I'll change. I'll be the husband you always deserved." 12 years, Robert," Helen said, feeling tears begin to form, but keeping her voice firm. 12 years I waited for you to become the husband you promised to be on our wedding day. 12 years I put your needs before mine, supported your dreams while burying my own, kept your house impeccable, greeted your clients with a smile on my face even when I was breaking inside. And what did I get in return? Betrayal, lies, disrespect. And now you want me to believe you'll change? Why? Because you got caught. Because you're facing consequences. "It's not like that," he protested. "I really love you, Helen. I always have. I just lost my way. But we can go back. We can rebuild." Ralph, who was listening to everything with an increasingly indignant expression, couldn't contain himself. "Robert, this is Ralph. Do you remember? Me, the cousin you told to shut up yesterday?" "What do you want, Ralph?" Robert replied with irritation. "I just wanted to congratulate you on your performance. Very convincing. One could almost believe you're genuinely remorseful and not just desperate because you lost control of the situation." "That's none of your business," Robert hissed. "It became my business the moment I saw you allow Helen to be humiliated in her own home," Ralph replied. "And it became everyone's business the moment we discovered you were stealing from the family company. So yes, Robert, it's my business and everyone's business here." Helen raised her hand, signaling for silence. "Robert, listen. I'm not making any decisions now at this moment. I'm tired, hurt, betrayed. I need time to process everything, to think clearly. Dr. Marianne is here, and we will discuss the next legal steps. You will learn everything through her. For now, we have nothing more to talk about." "Helen, wait," Robert pleaded, but she had already hung up. The silence that followed was heavy, but somehow liberating. Helen had spoken. She had set boundaries, she had taken a stand, and everyone in the room knew that this was a fundamental turning point. Marianne was the first to speak. "Helen, you handled that very well. You maintained your composure, you were clear, you set your terms. Now, we need to discuss the legal aspect. Do you want to file for separation?" Helen looked around the room at the faces that supported her. Sebastian, Aurora, Beatrice, Ralph, Marianne, all there by her side, ready to protect and defend her. For 12 years she had felt alone even when surrounded by people. And now, ironically, at the moment her marriage was ending, she finally felt supported, seen, valued. "Yes," she said, firmly. "I want to initiate separation proceedings. There's nothing left to save in this marriage. Perhaps there never was." Marianne nodded and began taking notes. "Very well. We'll need to conduct a full asset inventory. The mansion is already in your name, which simplifies things. We'll need to check bank accounts, investments, company shares, everything, and you are entitled to considerable alimony, given the standard of living you maintained during the marriage." "I don't want alimony," Helen said, surprising everyone. "I don't want anything that ties me to him or makes it seem like I'm taking advantage of the situation. I just want what is legitimately mine, the house which is apparently already in my name, and the possibility of starting my life over without having to look back." "Helen," Sebastian interjected, "you are entitled to much more than that. By law and by justice, you don't need to play the martyr." "I'm not playing the martyr," Helen replied. "I'm making a conscious choice. I want my freedom, not financial compensation. I want to prove to myself and to everyone that I can support myself, that I can rebuild my life, that I don't need to depend on anyone." Beatrice smiled with pride. "That's my girl." In the hours that followed, they discussed legal details, signed preliminary documents, made plans. Marianne explained that the separation process would take a few months, but could be accelerated, given that there was documented proof of infidelity. Ralph suggested that Helen consider giving a controlled interview to a reputable news outlet, to tell her version of the story in her own words before others did it for her. Sebastian guaranteed that, regardless of what happened with Robert, Helen would always be considered part of the family and would always have their support. When the meeting finally ended and everyone dispersed for lunch, Helen went up to her room, or rather to her room, no longer theirs. She looked around the space she had shared with Robert for so long and realized she no longer felt any emotional connection to that place. It was just a room, beautiful, comfortable, but empty of real meaning. She opened the closet and began separating Robert's clothes from hers. Every suit, every shirt, every tie was a memory of some party, some dinner, some event where she had been merely a beautiful accessory beside him. She put everything into suitcases, folded carefully, packed efficiently. Not out of respect for him, but out of respect for herself, because she wasn't the kind of person who destroyed things in a fit of rage. She was the kind of person who dealt with situations with dignity, even when those situations were painful. When she finished, there were 5 large suitcases full of Robert's clothes and belongings. She called Rosalind and asked her to summon Thomas, the driver, to take everything to the hotel where Robert was staying. She wanted nothing more of his there. She didn't want reminders. She didn't want ghosts of the past haunting her present. That night, the family dined together in the dining room. Aurora had insisted on cooking personally, saying they needed a home-cooked meal, something comforting and simple. She prepared a shepherd's pie with roasted vegetables, traditional British comfort food that filled the house with a welcoming aroma. Sitting around that table, eating those simple dishes, talking about trivial matters, Helen felt for the first time in a long time something that resembled peace. After dinner, Ralph called her for a private conversation in the garden. The two walked under the starry London sky, a sky rarely seen because of light pollution, but which seemed surprisingly clear that night. "How are you, really?" Ralph asked, stopping near the stone fountain in the center of the garden. Helen thought carefully before answering. "Honestly, I'm shattered. I feel like I've wasted 12 years of my life. I feel anger, sadness, regret, but I also feel something new, something I couldn't feel before." "What?" he asked with genuine interest. "Hope," Helen replied with a small smile. "I know it sounds strange considering the circumstances, but for the first time in years I feel like I have a future that is mine. Not a future planned by other people, not a future where I'm just a supporting character in someone else's life. My future. My choices. My life." Ralph smiled. "You know, I always thought you were special, Helen. From the first day I met you years ago at the wedding, you had something most people don't, a genuine kindness, a quiet strength. But it was so hidden beneath everyone's expectations that it was hard to see. I'm happy it's finally showing." Helen looked at Ralph, truly seeing him for the first time. He wasn't just the distant cousin, who rarely appeared. He was a good, upright man who had stood by her when no one else had the courage. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why did you defend me yesterday when you barely know me?" "Because it was right," he simply replied. "Because I saw an injustice being committed and I couldn't stay silent. And because perhaps on some level I understand what it's like to feel invisible in a noisy family full of big personalities. I live up in Scotland precisely for that reason. Because here, with all the Alastair Sterlings and their expectations and their traditions, I always felt suffocated. So when I saw you being suffocated in the same way, only much worse, I couldn't just watch." "Thank you," Helen said sincerely, "for everything, for defending me, for staying, for making me feel like I'm not alone in this." "You're not alone," Ralph assured her, "and you won't be. You can count on me, Helen, for whatever you need." They stood there for a few more minutes, in comfortable silence, just enjoying the night breeze and the sound of the fountain's water. Then they went back inside together, where they found Beatrice, Sebastian, and Aurora having tea in the living room. Helen sat beside Beatrice, accepting a cup of chamomile tea her aunt offered her. They talked about trivial things for a while, about the garden that needed new care, about a book Aurora was reading, about Ralph's plans to return to Edinburgh at the end of the week. It was so normal, so simple, so comforting. And it was there, in that moment of normalcy amidst the chaos, that Helen finally allowed the tears to fall. But they weren't just tears of sadness, they were tears of liberation, of relief, of a new beginning. Beatrice hugged her tightly, letting her cry as much as she needed. "It's all right, my dear, cry all you need to cry, because tomorrow you'll wake up and it will be a new day, and then another, and another, and each day will get a little easier. Each day you'll feel a little stronger, until one day you'll wake up and realize you're happy again." "I want to believe that," Helen sobbed. "Then believe it," Aurora said, joining the hug. "Because all of us believe in you. We see what you are capable of being, Helen, and we can't wait to see you flourish." In the days that followed, a lot happened. The company's official statement was released and generated a wave of public support for Helen and criticism for Robert. The external audit began, and the initial figures confirmed suspicions of embezzlement. Robert tried to make contact several times, but Helen remained firm in her decision to communicate only through lawyers. Julia Thorne was removed from her duties at the company after an investigation revealed that she had violated conduct policies by becoming romantically involved with a senior manager. Marissa, the young assistant Julia had mentioned, was transferred to another department to avoid any uncomfortable situations. Helen gave the interview Ralph had suggested, but not to talk about drama or scandal. She spoke about resilience, about finding strength in difficult times, about the importance of women supporting each other, about breaking patterns of silencing and submission. The interview was watched by millions of people and generated countless messages of support from women across the UK who identified with her story. 3 months later, on a sunny August morning, Helen woke up alone in her bedroom, now completely redecorated. She had changed the beige and white decor for shades of blue and aqua that she had always loved, but never had the courage to use. The curtains were lighter, letting in more sunlight. There were plants everywhere, bringing life and color to the space. And on the wall opposite the bed, she had hung a large painting of a woman with her back to the viewer, looking at the horizon, ready to move forward. She got up, had her breakfast in the garden, while reading emails on her tablet. There were several messages from NGOs that worked with supporting women in situations of domestic and emotional abuse, asking her to become a spokesperson or collaborator. Helen had begun to seriously consider using her experience and public exposure to help other women going through similar situations. Beatrice appeared in the garden, bringing more coffee. "Did you sleep well?" "Like an angel," Helen replied with a genuine smile. "I dreamed I was traveling, discovering new places, being free." "Then perhaps it's time to turn that dream into reality," Beatrice suggested. "When was the last time you took a real vacation? A vacation where you did what you wanted, went where you wanted, without having to consider anyone else's plans or preferences?" Helen thought and realized she couldn't remember. "Never," she admitted with a laugh. "Then it's settled," Beatrice declared. "We'll plan a trip, you and I. Perhaps Ralph would like to come too. We'll go somewhere beautiful, peaceful, where you can finally breathe and discover who Helen is when she's not being defined by the role she plays in other people's lives." The idea filled Helen with an excitement she hadn't felt in years. "Yes," she said, "let's do it. Let's really do it." And so, sitting in that sunny garden, drinking coffee with the aunt who had become her greatest ally, planning trips and new beginnings, Helen finally understood something fundamental. That horrible night, that public humiliation, that moment of unbearable pain had not been the end of her story. It had merely been the end of a chapter that needed to close for a new one to begin. She had lost a marriage, but she had found herself. She had been betrayed by the man who swore to love her, but she had been defended by people who truly cared. She had been publicly humiliated, but she had risen with a dignity that inspired thousands of other women to do the same. And now, with the separation process moving forward, with the unconditional support of her family, with new opportunities emerging every day, and with a freedom she had never experienced before, Helen was finally ready to write the next chapters of her own story, chapters where she would be the protagonist, not the supporting character, where her choices would matter, where her voice would be heard, where she could finally be complete and truly free. And that mansion in London, which had been the stage for so much silencing and pain, now echoed with laughter, plans, and hope. Because Helen had learned the most important lesson of all, that no matter how dark the night, the sun always rises again, and with it, a new chance to start anew. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope Helen's story has touched your heart. If you were moved by this incredible woman's journey of new beginnings and overcoming adversity, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what stood out to you most. Was it Helen's courage in finally finding her voice? Was it the family's support in siding with justice? Or was it the message that it's never too late to start over and seek your own happiness? Every day we bring you intense stories like this, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul and make us reflect on our own lives. Stories of pain and overcoming, of betrayal and forgiveness, of silence and liberation. We await you in the next episode with a new story that will stir your emotions and make you think. Until then, remember, you always deserve respect, dignity, and true love. Never accept less than that.